Boker Tov. Today's daf yomi is Bava Basra Samach Hey, Bava Basra 65. We're going to start on the last line on 64b. Today's daf yomi is dedicated for Yeshua, for the Chayalim, Atzalah, for the Shvuyim, and Shmira for Am Yisrael in this Eis Tzara. So in Rav Huna Marav Halacha, now we're on the top of 65a. The law is like the Chachamim. Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba Amar Shmuel says Halacha to Rabbi Akiva. So Rav Paskins like the Chachamim, and Shmuel Paskins like Rabbi Akiva. What are we paskening about? What are they paskening about? About when a person, the Gemara has been discussing, if a person sells their house, have they also sold, if they retained the well for themselves, then they also sell the easements around the well. So Rav Huna says that Rav Paskins like the Chachamim who say mocher ba'ayin ra mocher, that the seller is stingy in the sale. He sells as little as possible. And so therefore we assume he did not sell the easements around it. Whereas Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba says in the name of Shmuel, the law is like Rabbi Akiva who says, no, the assumption is that he did sell the easements because mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher. The seller sells with a generous spirit. So the Gemara says, but how could that be? Vazin nin sagin amrisa kamei derav hilchos Rabbi Akiva. Well, Amar Levo Amidi. He said, but several times I said in front of Rav, the law is like Rabbi Akiva, and he didn't object. Meaning, how can you say that Rav rules like the Chachamim? But several times I said in front of Rav that the law is like Rabbi Akiva, and he didn't object to me. So Rav Huna said back to Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, he said back to him, Amar Lei, Heichi Tanisa, how do you actually teach this? When you taught this to Rav, when you said this in front of Rav, how did you actually teach it? He said, well, Amar Lei Ipcha Tanina. He didn't say those words, Ipcha Tanina, but he said, actually, what I said was that you could sell it with ayin ra, but that was Rabbi Akiva's position. He said, well, that's why I didn't object, because you were saying that we paskin that the seller sells with an ayin ra, i.e., he has not sold the easement. Okay, good morning, Hobbs. Everything good? We're on 65a, 8 lines from the top. So Amarle Ravino Ravashi. So Lema Azdu Tamayo. So let's say that Shmuel, who paskins like Rabbi Akiva, and Rav, who paskins like Rav Huna, they follow their logic, they follow their position, meaning to say, in other circumstances, they also rule, Shmuel rules Mocher Bayin Yafa, that the seller sells everything, and the Rav rules like Rabbanu say Mocher Bayin Ra. Why? The Amar Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel. So Rav Nachman cited Shmuel. Achen Shachoku. Let's say you have brothers who divide up an estate. One brother says, I'll take the well, you take the house. Well, guess what? He doesn't have an automatic right to an easement. We assume he now has to purchase the easement. And they don't have an automatic right to put their ladder in the courtyard to gain access to their property. And they don't have an automatic airspace rights for their windows. They don't have an automatic right to get the water into their property. So this is basically like Shmuel's position that mocher ba'ayin yaf and mocher, and it's like Rabbi Akiva. Vizaru ba'ayin shalachos kavus, and be careful about these laws, says Rav Nachman, because these are fixed laws. Now, Rav Nachman was the Av Bezdin, so he's saying this is how we paskin. The Rav Amar Yeshla, and Rav says no, these brothers gain these easements, meaning to say when they divided it up, they retain that easement for themselves. They look at the brothers as though he's selling the other property to somebody else, and he retained the easement for himself. Excuse me, because if we had just had it, so the Gemara explains, and we need it in both cases. Tzricha, we need it in both cases. Because if we only had the ruling in the case of the brothers who divide up the estate, Vayikam Rav Mishum the Amrei, but Ameder Bey. That's where Rav might have said, okay, he retains the rights to the easements because he says, listen, I wanted to live in this property. I want to live here just like my father lived. You see, by the way, this is a beautiful idea. A person wants to live the way their father lived. But Ameder Bey, and secondly, because it says in Tehillim, in the place of your fathers will be your children. And this is the idea that the children want to live in the manner that their father lives. The literal pshat of this verse, according to Rashi's explanation in Tehillim, is that the Gemara is interpreting it about inheritance, but the literal explanation of the verse is that the psalm was said for the honor of Torah scholars, meaning to say that if you're a Torah scholar, your children will come in your place. The Even Ezra says it refers to the Mashiach, that just like the Mashiach will stand in his place, so to his children will be able to inherit the place of their father when he dies and the next king comes. Now the Gemara says, Avo Baha Ema Modu Shmuel. He says, but maybe in the case of the house and the well, we might have thought that Rav would admit to Shmuel's position. And if we only had the teaching by the well, I might have thought Shmuel. That's where Shmuel says that he sold everything of a Baha, but in the case of the estate, I might have thought that he agreed with Rav that he retained the easement. So therefore it's Tzricha, so therefore we need to be taught in both cases. Rav Nachman Rav Huna Hilchas Kavasin or Hilchas Kavasaychu. So Rav Nachman sees Rav Huna and he says, "Is the law like us? I pass him like Shmuel Mocher Bayin Yafa that he sells everything, or is it like you who say Mocher Bayin Ra that he doesn't sell anything?" So Rav Huna responds, "Amalei Hilchas Kavasaychu." He says the law is like you. The Mekravisu Bava Deresh Galusa Tishchichi Dayani. So he says the reason is because you are close to the gate of the Reish Galusa, and there are a lot of judges there. So Rav Nachman was the Av Bezdin. He was the head of the court, and he was the son-in-law of the Reish Galusa. The Reish Galusa was the person who was the non-rabbinic head of the community. And so therefore, he says the law is like you because you're around the whole bureaucracy. This is a tremendous statement of modesty on Rav Huna's part, recognizing the authority of Rav Nachman. Additionally, what I want to point out here is he says you're close to the gate of the Reish Galusa, Bava the Reish Galusa. We haven't even talked about why is our tractate called Bava. Bava Kama, Bava Mitzia, Bava Basra, the first gate, the second gate, the third gate. But we see from here that the gate was where they did the judicial actions, the judicial decisions. And therefore, since you're close to the gate of the Reish Galusa, it means you're close to the courts of the Reish Galusa. So this is a reference to why our tractate is called Bava Basra. Bava is a reference to a judicial proceeding. I don't know if we came across this so far in any of the Bavas, but I don't remember it offhand, but probably we did and I missed it, but here it is right here. Itmar, so says the Gemara, Shnei batim zelifnim mizeh. Let's say you have two houses and one house is inside the other house, meaning to say in order to get to the inner house, you have to walk through the external house to get to the inner house. Shneim b'mechar, shneim b'matane. If you gave away both as a sale and both as a gift, then the inner one doesn't have an easement, meaning to say he can't demand that the external house let him through in order to get to his house. It's for sure the case if the external one was by a gift, and we'll see what the difference between a gift and a sale here is when you give it away with respect to an easement. But if the internal one was with a sale, for sure we're going to say that since he sold, that the internal one can't demand that the one who got it as a gift give him the right to walk through his house. But let's say let's say the external one was via sale, upnimi b'matana, and the internal one was with a gift. Well, then savar mine. So the first initial assumption was Eilan Derel Zalzad. The initial assumption was here, and also in this case, the person who's on the inside the gift, he can't demand that the external one let him walk through his property because presumably that was sold to the external one with ayin yafa, and he therefore has the easement for himself, and he doesn't have an easement. He lost that right. But that's not the case. Milo Tanan, didn't we learn? All these laws, when do we say the Rabbanan say that he needs to purchase an easement? That's with the case of a sale, because we say he sold it with a stingy eye. That's when the Rabbanan say that he needs to purchase a easement with a sale. But that's only by a sale. But by a gift, the Rabbanan would assume that he gave it to him as a gift. He gave it to him with the right of the easement. No sin is cool. And you give it a law, you give it completely as a gift. Because the assumption is when you give a gift, you give to somebody you love, so you give it generously. The one who gives a gift gives it a generous spirit. And when you give a gift, you give it generously. And so therefore, the assumption is when he gave the gift to the person who's on the inside, he gave it to him with the right to walk through the outer side. And that's the assumption. Must be we're talking about a case, as the Rashbam says, that the two actions happen together. You gave it you gave it to one person and sold it to the other. And so you obviously then would want the person you're giving the gift to have this advantage of being able to walk through and have this right of the easement. So that's the assumption here. Up to the next Mishnah. Mochar asabayis. Mochar asadelas avalos amafteach. Oh, I meant to look this up. I meant to look up keys in the time of the Talmud, because we have to imagine that the structure of the keys is totally different than what we would imagine a key like today. That a key today, everybody walks around with a key, open a door. Those keys, I'll Google it after we get off. I assume that those keys were something that was a movable item, but it was pretty much usually attached to the house, and it was like a skeleton key. So it was more like an appliance, like a tool, than a specific thing to get into that door. So, meaning to say like a general tool, more like a screwdriver. So somebody sells a house, he has sold the door, but not the key. And the general rule is, Rashbam writes, Kol tashmishe bayis hakvuim mechurim b'kol bayis. Anything that's fixed is sold with the house, and the movable things are not sold. And this is, generally speaking, a principle in today's real estate as well, that it's something that's fixed to the house is sold, not fixed is not sold. But the question is, what makes something fixed? If it's screwed in, if it's plugged in, these are questions where there's nuance. If it's glued down, is that fixed? So anyway, the Gemara is going to discuss this, but this is something that in our modern day real estate is a discussion as well. So mochar sabayis mochar as a deles, navalo as a mafteach, but you have not sold the key. Mochar as a machtesh as kavua, you sold the grinder, the mill that's attached to the ground. Navalo as a metaltelis, but not the parts that are movable. Mochar as a strobel, you sold the strobel. This is like a piece that was on top of the mill that was fixed to the ground. Avoloas akeles, but not the part that was movable. Avoloas atanar, avoloas akirayim. You have not sold the oven and the stove because they were movable. Now, bisman sha'amarlo, hu v'kol mashav v'socho, when he said, I'm selling it and everything that's in it, All right, cool, Mechur. And you could always stipulate, I'm selling it and everything in it, then everything is sold, or on top of 65B. So the Gemara says, well, Lema Masnisin, the local Rebbe Meir. Let's just say our Mishnah that says that you have not sold the movable mill. If you sell your house and there's a appliance in there that's not attached, you haven't sold it. That's not like Rebbe Meir. The Rebbe Meir, Ha'amar Machar Sakerem, Machar Tashmishi Kerem. Rebbe Meir says, if you sold the vineyard, you also sold the Tashmishi Kerem. What is the Tashmishi Kerem? So the Tashmishi Kerem are the poles that uphold the grapevines. I heard from Rabbi Razer, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said that why do we compare a bride and a groom? The Gemara compares it to Invei Agafen, to grapevines, because grapevines are upheld. They're the only trees that you require. They're upheld by these poles. And so therefore, that's like the bride and the groom are being upheld by the poles of their families around them. So he says, it's not like Rebbe Meir, because Rebbe Meir says you sold the poles associated with the vineyard. And here, our Mishnah is saying you have not sold the movable appliances. Gemara says, Afilu Teima Rebbe Meir, you could even say it's Rebbe Meir, Hasam Kavia. There, when Rebbe Meir says that you have sold the poles, there we're talking about a case about these poles that are attached. They're always in the vineyard. You never move them. And even though they're not fixed to the ground, but they're always there. But this mill, which is not attached to the ground, sometimes you lend it out. And so therefore, the poles are always in the vineyard, but the mill is sometimes moving around. Versus, what are you talking about? But it says you sold the door, but not the key. And it must be that the key is like the door. Just like the door is fixed, the key is also, you never move the key. So Rashbam explains there are some keys that you never move them from the opening, like in some villages, and still we say you haven't sold the key. Again, you have to look to understand exactly how their keys functioned, but the assumption is that I think what we're talking about here is the key that you lock it up and then you throw it like on a hook inside the house so that people can't get to it from the outside. That would be my assumption, to give you privacy on the inside. So Gemara says, so our Mishnah, which says that you don't sell the appliances which can be moved, even though they're not moved, is not like Rabbi Meir, who says that they are sold. Okay, so now the Gemara says, Tan Rabbanan, Amocharas Abayis Macharas Adeles. You sold your house, you sold the door, Ve'esanagar, and you sold the bolt around the door that come down for security purposes, the security bolt, Ve'esamanul, and you've sold the manul. This is like the lock that's attached to the door. Avalos Mafteach, but you have not sold the key. Macharas Mafteches, Hachakuka, you've sold the mill that's fully attached to the ground. Meaning to say, let's say it was like there was a rock that came out from the wall, and into that rock you carved out a place to grind the grains. So macharas machteshes hachakuka, that part you sold because it's fully attached. Avaloas hakavua, but not the millstone that you went and attached to the ground, but you didn't carve it into the ground. Machara itztrobel avaloas hakelas, you sold the itztrobel. You sold the itztrobel. This is, we said, a piece of wood that you put on top of the mill and you fully attached it, but not the kelas. This is the part of the millstone that you move around, and you can, and it's movable. You haven't sold the stove and the oven and the millstones because they move. Rabbi Eliezer said, Rabbi Eliezer says, anything that's attached to the ground is like the ground. And so therefore we have to see what Rebbe Lezer is saying. But Rebbe Lezer, says the Rashbam, is arguing with the Machteshes that's attached. Meaning, say not only the one that's ground into the earth directly, but even the one that you took and then attached to the ground, it's going to be considered to be sold. And he argues with the Rabbanan who say that millstone is not sold. Then the Brisa continues, Bizman Omer lo hu v'kol ma shebasocho harei kulu mechurin. If he says I'm selling it and everything that's attached to and everything that's in it, then everything is sold. In any event, he has not sold the wells and the cisterns and the annex. So now the Gemara talks about, since Rebbe Lezer said that if you took it and you attached it to the ground, you took the utensil and attached it to the ground, it's considered to be like it's attached, and now it's sold with the house. The Gemara is going to try to connect this with a discussion about mikvaos. We're going to talk about a mikvah a little bit, and then we're going to go a little bit far afield and some other issues on tomorrow's daf. The basic idea of a mikvah is that a mikvah has to come either from rainwater or from spring water. If a mikvah comes from drawn water, water that was first collected in a utensil, and then the mikvah is not going to be kosher. The dispute whether it's biblically not kosher or rabbinically not kosher, but that's called mayim she'uvin, drawn water. There are three ways to take the water that was drawn and still be able to use it for the mikvah. One is called hamshacha, one is called zriya, one is called nishika. We do all three of these methods in order to allow us to use the mikvah, the modern day mikvah, which basically, otherwise you can't just go in rainwater every day for years and it'll get disgusting. So we take the initial rainwater and then we combine it with tap water using these three methods. Either nishika is kissing, hamshacha is that the water goes through a period of time. It doesn't go straight from the tap into the pit. It goes onto the ground first, or zriya, it goes into one pit and then overflows into the other. But that's just very, 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 very quick way. And when we built the mikvah at Olav Shalom, of course, we did all three of these things. So now the Gemara says, Tan Rabbanan, Sinor Shechakaku Ubesof Kavu. So let's say you have a piece of wood, a pipe, that first you carved out and then you attach it to the ground. Well, that's going to be considered still like a utensil, because first it was turned into a utensil and then you attach it, so it's a utensil. So therefore, if the water goes into it, posel as a mikvah, that disqualifies the mikvah. But kavu b'sof chakaku, but if it was first attached to the ground and then you carved it out, then eno posel as a mikvah, then it's not considered a utensil, and then the water in it is not considered drawn water, mayim shuvin, and the mikvah is kosher. So who is this like? Mani lo Rebbe Eliezer lo Rabbanan. It's not like Rebbe Eliezer, because Rabbi Eliezer says that even if you make the utensil and then attach it, it's still going to be considered, like Rabbi Eliezer said about the Machteshes Kavua, is sold with the house. So if you make the utensil and then attach it, it's no longer going to be considered a utensil. That argues with this. That argues with this Tosefta, and it's not like the Rabbanan, because the Rabbanan say in both cases, the Rabbanan say that would be considered to be, what's the Rabbanan in this Mishnah, that he said that you have not sold the Rabbanan say you have not sold the Machteshes that was attached to the ground. And so therefore the Rabbanan view that Machteshes as movable. So they would view this as a movable item. So therefore the Gemara says, it's not like the Rabbanan or not like Rebbe Eliezer. Hi, Rebbe Eliezer. Which Rebbe Eliezer is it not like? Rebbe Eliezer, Tobias. If you want to say it's not like the Rebbe Eliezer, what we talked about, that if you took a utensil and then attached to the ground, it's not going to be considered like it's attached. That Rebbe Eliezer says that it's attached to the ground. So in this case, if you carved out a pipe and then attached to the ground, it should not be mayim she'uvin. Dilma, maybe it's totally different reasoning. Hainu time with the Rebbe Eliezer. That what's the reason why Rebbe Eliezer rules like that by a house is because the reason why it's not sold is the reason why Rebbe Eliezer says it's sold under the circumstances is because he's of the position mocher bayin yafim mocher. It's nothing to do with mayim she'uvin and the utensil. It's just that he says the seller sells everything. It's just a specific law about selling. Rabbanan Savri, Mocher Bayin Ra Mocher. And the Rabbanan say under those circumstances it's not sold, not because they're going to view it as a utensil, but because they say that it's a specific law about selling that we say Bayin Ra Mocher. He didn't include it. So therefore, the Gemara is going to say it's Rebbe Eliezer to Kaveras Devarim. It's Rebbe Eliezer about a beehive. The Tanan, what does Rebbe Eliezer say about a beehive? Rebbe Eliezer says, we learned in the Mishnah in Shavias, Harei Kikarka, the goes finala prusbol. That if let's say you have let's say you have a beehive, what's the status of a beehive that you then attached to the ground with like some mud? Let's say Rebbe Lezer says it's going to be considered like it's real estate. So if somebody just owns the beehive, it's like you own real estate. And then Kosvin prusbol, you can write a prusbol on it. What does that mean? A lender is only allowed to write a prusbol if he lent money to a person who has who owns real estate. And we'll have to see why in tomorrow's daf. We'll go into the Rashbam. We'll explain why. And it doesn't bimkoma. As long as it's in its place, it does not contract tuma. And also the roda mimena b'Shabbos chayav chatas. If somebody takes honey off of it on Shabbos, like you're removing something from the ground, then you're liable for sin offering. So Rebbe Eliezer says that is going to be considered like it's attached to the ground under those circumstances. But in this case, this source, Rebbe Eliezer, is saying that in this case of the mikvah, Rebbe Eliezer said, the Brisa says that if you make the wood and then attach it into a pipe and then attach it to the ground, it's considered mayim shuvin, whereas meaning to say it's going to be considered a utensil. Whereas here, Rebbe Eliezer is saying that the beehive is not a utensil, it's attached to the ground. So we're going to go into that in tomorrow's daf. We'll stop here. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to address. The big shkoyach.